Young black boy stands against injustice. His courage sparks a movement. The struggle in silence. Malik Jackson was no stranger to pain, though he had learned to mask it over the years. The truth was, at just 15 years old, he had experienced more trauma than most kids his age. His story was one that blended heartbreak, silence, and an ever-present need to be something more than what society had labeled him. Growing up in Oak Ridge, a quiet suburban town known for its picturesque streets and white picket fences, Malik often felt like an outsider. The town was predominantly white, and in the classroom, Malik stuck out like a sore thumb. His classmates, with their easy smiles and confident strides, had no idea what it was like to navigate life as a young black boy. Malik didn't just stand out for the color of his skin, though. He stood out because in a town like Oak Ridge, the few black kids were often viewed as anomalies. They were either ignored or made the target of whispers and sideways glances. Malik's parents had always instilled in him a sense of pride, of dignity, and of strength. His mother, Denise, was a force of nature. She was beautiful, brilliant, and had taught Malik from an early age that being black was something to be proud of. She would tell him stories about their ancestors, about people who fought to overcome unimaginable odds, and how their blood ran thick with the strength of generations that never gave up. "You carry the legacy of warriors, Malik," she would say as she tucked him in at night, her voice soft but unwavering. "Never let anyone make you feel small. You are mighty." But Malik knew. He knew that no matter how proud his parents were of their heritage, the world often saw him through a different lens, a lens that reduced him to the color of his skin, to the stereotypes that had been perpetuated for centuries. His father, James, was a quiet, stoic man. He worked as a mechanic, his hands calloused from years of hard labor. James didn't say much, but Malik could feel the pressure mounting on his father's shoulders, a pressure that came with trying to raise a family in a town where they were often treated like second-class citizens. James didn't talk about the struggles he faced. He simply worked harder. He would return home late every evening, exhausted from hours of fixing cars, only to sit at the kitchen table and nod in quiet agreement with Malik's mother's words of encouragement. James's silence spoke volumes, though. Malik could see the weariness in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of their reality. Malik had learned from an early age that being a black boy in Oak Ridge meant walking a fine line between surviving and thriving. There was a quiet kind of racism that lingered in the town. No one said anything outright, but it was there in the way people looked at you, in the way doors would shut a little faster when you approached, in the way teachers would subtly ignore you in class. It wasn't overt hate. It was the kind of discrimination that people thought didn't exist anymore. It was the kind of hate that wasn't loud, but was deeply ingrained in the system, in the culture, in the very air he breathed. At Oak Ridge High School, Malik was often forced to shrink into the background. He wasn't one to speak out, preferring to observe and learn from a distance. His classmates, for the most part, treated him like he was invisible. There were a few who would nod politely when they passed him in the halls, but for the most part, Malik was just another face in the crowd. Jamal Thompson, the only other black kid in the entire school, was Malik's only real connection. Jamal was in his grade, but they weren't exactly friends. They exchanged a few words here and there, but Jamal wasn't the outgoing type. He was quiet, reserved, and had a way of blending into the background like Malik did. They would sit together sometimes in the cafeteria, not talking much, just sharing the unspoken understanding that they were in this together. But that understanding, though comforting, also felt isolating. Malik often thought that the school felt more like a battleground than a place for learning. The teachers, though not openly hostile, often treated him like he was invisible. He'd raise his hand, but the teacher would call on someone else. He'd answer a question correctly, but the compliment would be directed at the white kids around him. It was like he had to prove himself every single day just to be noticed. And then there were the kids. The football players, the cheerleaders, the kids who ran in groups of 5 or 6 and made everyone else feel like an outsider. Malik had seen it happen 1,000 times. If you weren't one of them, you were nothing. The whispers and cruel words always seemed to find him when he was alone, in the hallways, in the locker rooms. Go back to where you came from. they'd say, laughing. What? No one told you you don't belong here. Malik had learned how to hide the hurt, how to hold his head high even when every part of him screamed to lash out. He had seen how the school responded when someone like him fought back. They would label him as the angry black kid, the troublemaker, the one who couldn't fit in no matter how hard he tried. But things were different that day. That day, everything changed. It was lunchtime in the Oak Ridge High cafeteria when Malik's world was suddenly turned upside down. He was sitting alone, as usual, at the far end of the room. The hum of conversation surrounded him, but he was used to being alone. The windows offered a view of the courtyard outside, and Malik often found solace in the quietness of watching the world go by. He hadn't noticed Jamal at first, but then he heard the sound of footsteps, the slight rustle of the cafeteria tray, and saw Jamal sitting across from him. "Hey, Malik," Jamal said softly. His voice had an unusual tremor, as if something heavy weighed on his words. Malik didn't know how to respond. He had never seen Jamal this upset before. They had talked before, but this was different. Jamal looked down at his lunch, but his eyes were distant. There were tears in his eyes, and Malik could see the pain behind them. "They called me a slave again," Jamal whispered, as though speaking the words aloud made them real in a way he couldn't escape. Malik's stomach dropped. He had heard the words before, from the same group of kids who had tormented Jamal over the years. But hearing it again, seeing the toll it had taken on Jamal, hit Malik harder than he expected. Jamal stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, his tray falling to the ground. He didn't say anything more. He just ran out of the cafeteria. Malik could see him bolting down the hallway, the tears now streaming down his face, his body trembling as he disappeared from sight. For a moment, everything in the cafeteria seemed to pause. The laughter, the chattering, it all faded away. Malik's hands clenched into fists. The anger inside him burned, hotter than anything he had ever felt before. He couldn't let this happen. Not again. Not to Jamal. Not to anyone. A moment of courage. Malik stood frozen in the hallway, the echo of Jamal's retreating footsteps ringing in his ears. The cafeteria doors were still swinging lightly, as if the world outside hadn't noticed the devastation that had just unfolded within. The angry words Jamal had spoken still hung in the air like smoke, words that would never quite dissipate from Malik's mind. "They called me a slave again." The anger surged through him, hot and suffocating. His fists clenched, his jaw tightened, and for a brief moment he felt a powerful, overwhelming urge to chase after the people who had done this, to drag them into the very place where Jamal had run from and make them see the pain they caused. But that wouldn't solve anything. It wasn't enough to just lash out, to let the anger swallow him. He had to do more. For Jamal. For himself. For everyone who had ever been crushed beneath the weight of that cruelty. But there was a problem. Malik had never been good at standing up for himself, let alone for others. The fear of rejection, the crushing weight of knowing that he was a black kid in a school where he was constantly othered, had always held him back. Every time he thought about speaking out, he imagined how his classmates would react. They would laugh. They would mock him. They would call him angry, too sensitive, too much. They would see him as the problem. So he had kept his head down, buried his thoughts, and let the pain fester in silence. But now Jamal's pain was his pain. And Malik wasn't sure how much longer he could stay silent. His heart pounded in his chest as he slowly turned and made his way toward the gym. He wasn't sure where he was going, but his feet moved almost of their own accord. The gym had always been a place of refuge for him, a place where he could let his thoughts drift and forget about the world outside. But today, he wasn't running away. He was running towards something he wasn't entirely sure he could face. He found Jamal outside, leaning against the brick wall at the back of the school. The wind whipped through the trees, and the rustle of the leaves was the only sound between them. Jamal's shoulders were hunched, his face hidden in his hands as he tried to wipe away the tears that were still falling. It was the first time Malik had seen Jamal so broken, so vulnerable, and the sight shattered something inside him. Malik took a step closer, hesitated, then took another. "I'm sorry, man." Jamal's voice was muffled by his hands, but the pain in it was undeniable. Malik stood in silence for a moment, unsure of what to say. He had never been one for comforting words. He was better at pretending things didn't bother him, at putting on a mask and pretending everything was okay. But now, standing in front of his friend, everything felt different. There was no hiding from this, no pretending it was someone else's problem. "You don't deserve that," Malik said finally, his voice shaky. He felt his throat tighten as he spoke, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the weight of everything his friend had gone through, everything he himself had gone through. "I don't care what they think," Jamal said, his voice raw. "It's just, it gets to you, you know? After a while, you just don't know how to fight it anymore." Malik nodded. He understood. It wasn't just the name-calling, the slurs, the whispers behind your back. It was the cumulative weight of it all, the way it slowly wore you down until you didn't even recognize the person you were becoming. He had felt it too, every time someone ignored him, or worse, treated him like he was invisible. But hearing Jamal's pain, seeing it in his eyes, it felt like the last straw. Something inside Malik snapped. He couldn't stand by anymore. Couldn't let anyone feel like they didn't matter. Malik sat down next to him, the cold cement pressing against his legs. He didn't have a plan, didn't know exactly what to do, but for the first time, he wasn't going to stay silent. "I'm going to tell someone," Malik said firmly. "I don't care if they laugh at me. I'm not just going to sit here and let them keep doing this to you, to us." Jamal looked at him, disbelief flashing across his face. "What? How? They'll never listen to us, Malik. We're just the kids no one cares about." "They'll listen now," Malik said, the certainty in his voice surprising even him. "Because we're not going to stop until they do. I'm not going to let you suffer in silence, Jamal. Not anymore." The words hung between them, both frightening and freeing. Malik had no idea where this sudden surge of courage had come from. He was terrified. But deep down, he knew that there was no turning back. Jamal needed him. The school needed to see that there were consequences for this kind of hatred. And Malik, despite all his fears and doubts, was going to make sure it happened. But the question was, where did he start? Who would listen? Who would care enough to take a stand with him? Malik's mind raced as he stood up, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. But there was one person who might understand, the person he had always admired, but never had the courage to speak to. Mrs. Harper, his history teacher. She had always been kind to him, always encouraged him in class, even when other teachers had ignored him. She seemed to be one of the few adults in the school who genuinely cared. If anyone could help him figure out how to make a difference, it was her. Jamal wiped his eyes, the last of his tears drying on his cheeks. He gave Malik a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, man, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Malik replied. "Just know that you're not alone in this." As they walked toward the school entrance, Malik felt a strange mix of fear and hope. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing the right thing. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. He was going to make sure Jamal wasn't the only one who suffered in silence anymore. The next morning, Malik barely slept. His mind churned with the decision he had made, telling someone, standing up, being seen. The weight of it was heavy, but there was no turning back now. He had already made up his mind. Jamal needed him. And so did everyone else who had been quietly suffering at the hands of hateful words and discriminatory actions. As Malik sat at his kitchen table, his mother's voice cut through the silence, as it often did. "Malik, you okay? You've barely touched your breakfast." Malik blinked, startled. He hadn't realized he was so lost in thought. "Yeah, I'm good. Just thinking." His mother looked at him with a knowing expression, the lines around her eyes deepening slightly. She had always been a hard worker, trying to make ends meet after Malik's father passed away when he was just a baby. But even in her exhaustion, she still managed to make sure her son felt safe and loved. She could tell when something was off. Thinking about what? Malik hesitated for a moment. His mother knew him better than anyone, but this was different. He wasn't sure he was ready to explain it all to her, especially when the reality of what he was about to do still hadn't fully settled within him. But he knew he had to be honest. "I'm going to talk to Mrs. Harper today. About Jamal. About what's been happening at school." His mother stopped what she was doing, turning slowly to face him. The look on her face was unreadable for a moment, but then she nodded slowly as if she understood. It wasn't the first time Malik had been faced with a tough situation, but this felt different. This wasn't just another fight at school or another misunderstanding. This was about something bigger. "I'm proud of you, Malik," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It takes a lot of courage to speak up, but you've got to be careful. Not everyone will understand." Malik nodded. He had been thinking about that too. He had no illusions about how this could go. He wasn't naive enough to believe that just because he spoke out, things would magically change. He had seen it all before. Whispers behind his back, people shrugging off the racism they'd been taught to ignore. But maybe, just maybe, if enough of them heard the truth, things could start to shift. After school, Malik went straight to Mrs. Harper's classroom. The hallway was buzzing with the usual chaos of kids rushing to their next class, but Malik felt like he was moving through a fog. He didn't want to waste any more time. As he knocked lightly on Mrs. Harper's door, his heart skipped a beat. "Come in," came the familiar voice from within. Malik opened the door slowly, his palms clammy with nerves. Mrs. Harper looked up from her desk, her warm smile always making him feel like he could approach her with anything. She was a black woman, older than most of the teachers at the school, but her wisdom and kindness had earned her the respect of everyone who crossed her path. She was different, one of the few adults who really saw him. "Malik, what can I do for you?" He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I need to talk to you about something. It's about Jamal." At the mention of Jamal's name, Mrs. Harper's expression immediately shifted from casual to attentive. "What happened?" Malik took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice. "There's been a lot of stuff happening to him at school. People keep calling him names, making fun of him, and I don't know if anyone knows, but it's been getting worse. It's racism, Mrs. Harper, and I don't think anyone's doing anything about it." Mrs. Harper's eyes softened, and she motioned for Malik to sit down. "I know Jamal. He's a good kid. What exactly have you seen happening?" Malik hesitated, the words swirling in his mind. He had never really spoken about racism before. Not like this, not with an adult. But as he started to speak, the floodgates opened, and everything he had been holding inside poured out in a rush. "I've seen the looks, the way people ignore him. I've heard the things they say when they think no one's listening. But yesterday was the worst. Some of the guys, they called him a slave and said he should go back to Africa. And Jamal was so upset. I couldn't just let it go anymore. I want to do something about it, but I don't know where to start." Mrs. Harper listened intently, her expression grim. "You've taken the first step, Malik, just by speaking up. Most people don't want to get involved because they're afraid of what it will cost them. But it's not about them. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's hard." Malik swallowed, the weight of her words settling deep in his chest. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this." "You are," Mrs. Harper said, with a gentle smile. "Strength doesn't come from not being afraid. It comes from doing what you know is right, even when you're scared." Malik sat back, taking in her words. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone in this, like there was someone, an adult, who understood. Mrs. Harper didn't just care about the subject matter she taught. She cared about her students, about what they went through, and right now, Malik needed that. "Can we talk to the principal about this?" he asked. "Can we make something happen?" Mrs. Harper nodded. "We can. I'll be with you every step of the way. I'll make sure your voices are heard. But Malik, I want you to know something. This fight won't be easy. You'll face resistance, but there's something powerful about standing up for what's right, even when others won't." Malik nodded, his heart pounding. This wasn't just about Jamal anymore. It was about everyone who had been hurt, silenced, or ignored. And for the first time, he felt like he had the strength to do something about it. The ripple of change. Malik woke up the next morning feeling like he was stepping into the unknown. As he stared at the ceiling of his room, his thoughts were jumbled. What had he gotten himself into? Yesterday had been the first time he had ever said anything about the racism Jamal faced, and now it felt like he was standing at the edge of something bigger than he could understand. He thought back to his conversation with Mrs. Harper. Her words echoed in his mind. Strength doesn't come from not being afraid. It comes from doing what you know is right, even when you're scared. And she was right. He had to do this. Not just for Jamal, but for every kid who had ever felt like they didn't belong. When Malik arrived at school, he was quiet, lost in his own thoughts. The usual chatter of his classmates seemed distant, almost like it didn't matter. The weight of what he had decided to do pressed on his shoulders. It wasn't just about standing up for Jamal anymore. It was about standing up for his community, for the people who didn't have a voice. He met Jamal in the hallway between classes. Jamal was quieter than usual, his eyes red like he hadn't gotten enough sleep. Malik had noticed the way the other students looked at him, like he was a threat just for existing, just for being black. "Hey, man," Malik said softly, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. Jamal looked up, giving him a small, tired smile. "Hey, Malik, you ready for this?" Malik nodded, though the truth was he didn't feel ready at all. "Yeah, I think so. I talked to Mrs. Harper. We're going to talk to the principal today, see if we can get something done." Jamal's smile faded slightly, replaced with a look of uncertainty. "I don't know, man. What if they don't listen? What if this just makes things worse?" "I get it," Malik said, "but I can't just sit here and do nothing. You shouldn't have to go through this." Jamal looked at him for a long moment and then nodded. "I appreciate it, Malik. I really do. I don't know what happens after we speak up." Malik put a hand on his friend's shoulder, giving him an encouraging squeeze. "We won't be doing it alone. Mrs. Harper's backing us up, and when we stand together, they'll have to listen." The bell rang, signaling the start of class. They walked into the room, but Malik couldn't focus. His mind was racing with the thought of what was to come. He had a lot of questions and very few answers. Would the principal believe them? Would things get worse before they got better? Later that day, Malik and Jamal found themselves sitting outside the principal's office, waiting for their meeting. It felt surreal, like they were stepping into unknown territory. Malik wasn't sure what to expect, but his heart raced as he thought about what they were about to do. As the door opened and Mrs. Harper stepped out, her face was serious. "They're ready to see you," she said, motioning for them to follow her inside. The principal's office was large, intimidating, with dark wood paneling and an oversized desk that made him feel small. Mrs. Harper sat next to them, her presence comforting, but even she couldn't hide the tension in the air. "Good afternoon, Malik, Jamal," Principal Harris said, not bothering to stand. He glanced at a piece of paper on his desk before looking back at them. "What seems to be the problem?" Malik felt his palms sweat as he spoke. "It's about the bullying. The way Jamal's been treated by some of the other students. They've been calling him names, making racist comments. It's been going on for a while now, but it's getting worse. We need to do something about it." There was a pause. Principal Harris didn't respond immediately. His eyes flicked to Mrs. Harper, then back to them. "I see," he said slowly, his voice neutral. "But these things, they aren't always as clear-cut as you think. Kids will be kids, you know?" The words hit Malik like a punch to the gut. Kids will be kids? This wasn't just a little teasing. This was racism, and Principal Harris was dismissing it, treating it like it was nothing. Malik's anger flared up, but he clenched his fists, trying to hold it in. "We're not talking about kids being kids," Jamal spoke up, his voice trembling but strong. "We're talking about people who are hurting me, and no one's doing anything to stop it." Malik looked at Jamal, who was now standing up for himself in a way Malik had never seen before. It made him proud, and it made him even more determined to see this through. Principal Harris seemed to shift in his seat, but he still didn't seem convinced. "I'll look into it. I can't promise anything. We don't tolerate bullying, but we also don't want to make assumptions." Malik could feel the disappointment welling up inside him. They'd come this far, only to be met with indifference. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, his voice rising in frustration. "You're saying this isn't serious?" The room fell silent. Mrs. Harper looked like she was about to say something, but before she could speak, Malik cut in. "We need something done now, not later. This isn't just about us, it's about every kid in this school who's been ignored, overlooked, and hurt by things like this." Principal Harris stared at him for a long moment, his face unreadable. Finally, he sighed. "I'll have a meeting with the school board. We'll look into the issue and get back to you, but we're going to need more than just your word for it." Jamal slumped in his chair, looking defeated. Malik couldn't blame him. They'd hoped for a change, a sign that the adults would help them fight for what was right. Instead, they were left with empty promises. As Malik and Jamal walked out of the principal's office, the weight of their conversation with Principal Harris hung heavily between them. The door shut behind them with a soft click, but it felt like the world outside was much colder than it had been when they entered. Jamal didn't say anything at first. His shoulders slumped as they walked down the hallway. Malik could feel the tension in his friend's every step. The fight they'd hoped would be met with understanding had only made things worse. "You all right?" Malik asked, trying to break the silence. Jamal didn't respond right away, his eyes cast downward as he walked beside Malik. Finally, he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know, man. It just feels like no one cares." Malik's heart ached for his friend. He had seen Jamal go through so much, but the pain in his voice was different now. It was the kind of pain that came from disappointment, from having someone who was supposed to help, turn their back on you when you needed them most. "I get it, man, I do," Malik said, his voice quieter than usual. "But we can't give up. This isn't just about us. This is about every kid who's ever felt invisible because of the color of their skin. We have to keep pushing." Jamal stopped walking and turned to face him. "What's the point? We talked to the principal, we've done everything right, and still nothing changes. How are we supposed to fix this?" Malik paused, looking at Jamal with a determination he didn't fully understand himself. "Maybe we can't fix it all at once, but we have to keep fighting for what's right. It's not just about one person. It's about a system that has been broken for so long, and it's not going to change if we just give up." Jamal looked at him, still skeptical, but there was something in Malik's words that seemed to spark a flicker of hope. "You really think we can change things?" "I know we can," Malik said firmly. "We might not see the change right away, but if we don't keep fighting, then nothing will ever change." They both stood there for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling in the space between them. Malik knew they weren't done yet. This was just the beginning. The next few days were a blur for Malik. He couldn't stop thinking about what happened in Principal Harris's office. The more he thought about it, the more the words stung. "We don't tolerate bullying." But it felt like the school wasn't doing enough. It wasn't just about words. It was about actions, and so far, he hadn't seen any. Malik couldn't shake the feeling that something had to change, something bigger than just a conversation with the principal. But what could they do? Who could they turn to? Then, during lunch one day, Malik had an idea. He had been talking to Mrs. Harper more in the past week, and her passion for justice had rubbed off on him. If the school wasn't going to listen, then maybe it was time to take it outside the school, maybe even outside the town. He sat down with Jamal at their usual table, his mind racing. "What if we went to the community?" he asked, his voice serious. "What if we started speaking to the people who can actually do something about this?" Jamal looked at him, confusion on his face. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Malik said, lowering his voice so no one else could hear, "what if we talked to the local news, the reporters? What if we went to the people in the town who actually have the power to make things happen?" At first, Jamal looked hesitant, like he was afraid of drawing even more attention to the situation. But as Malik explained his plan, his words filled with passion. Jamal's skepticism began to fade. Maybe this was the change they needed. That afternoon, Malik met with Mrs. Harper after school. He could tell by the way she looked at him that she knew exactly what he was thinking. "You're thinking about going public, aren't you?" she asked, her voice calm but understanding. Malik nodded. "I think it's the only way to make a real change. The principal didn't take us seriously. Maybe the community will." Mrs. Harper met her gaze thoughtful. "I can help, but we have to be ready for the consequences. Taking this public means opening up a conversation that a lot of people might not be ready to have." Malik swallowed hard. "I'm ready. We're ready." Mrs. Harper smiled softly. "Then let's do it." Over the next week, Malik and Jamal worked together to prepare for the story they were about to share. They wrote letters to local news outlets explaining what had been happening at the school and how they needed to make a change. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about every kid who had been hurt, every child who had ever been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin. When the story finally broke, it spread quickly. Local news outlets ran the story, and soon, social media was buzzing with people supporting Malik and Jamal's bravery. Some were angry, calling for action. Others were skeptical, questioning the validity of their claims. But Malik knew that the conversation had finally started, and it was only the beginning. The ripple effects of Malik and Jamal's decision were felt throughout the town. There were protests, rallies, and town meetings as the community began to confront its issues with race head-on. Malik was proud of what they had started, but he knew the fight wasn't over. The town had to change, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But as he looked at Jamal, standing beside him as they walked down the hall together, Malik knew they had already won something important. They had spoken up, they had made the world notice, and that was the first step toward creating real change. As this part of the story unfolds, Malik and Jamal's battle becomes something bigger than themselves. They begin to change not just their school, but their town. The fight continues, but they know that they've already made an impact. The ripple effects of their bravery will continue to reverberate through their community, and soon, the entire world will be forced to pay attention. The first week after Malik and Jamal went public with their story was a whirlwind. The initial shock of the news had faded, but the conversation was far from over. People in the town had started to speak out, some in support of the boys, while others, surprisingly, had begun to question the motives behind their actions. Malik had braced himself for criticism, but nothing could prepare him for the venom that some would spew. As the story continued to gain traction, a local TV station reached out to Malik for an interview. At first, he was nervous, unsure of how he would handle speaking to an audience so much larger than just his school. But his mom had always told him that if he was going to fight for what was right, he needed to stand tall, no matter who was watching. On the morning of the interview, Malik felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He sat in front of the camera, his heart racing, as the anchorwoman, a sharp and confident woman named Patricia, introduced him to the viewers. Malik Thompson, Patricia began, is one of the students from West Valley High School who has sparked a town-wide conversation about racism in schools. He's here with us today to share his story. Malik, thank you for being with us. Malik nodded, trying to steady his nerves. The camera's bright lights felt almost blinding, but he focused on the question that was coming his way. So Malik, Patricia asked, her voice gentle but probing, tell us a little bit about why you decided to speak out. What made you feel that your school wasn't doing enough? Malik took a deep breath, recalling the countless hours he'd spent thinking about the injustice he and Jamal had faced. It wasn't just about me and Jamal, he said, his voice steady now. It's about every kid who's ever felt invisible or been treated differently because of the color of their skin. And I couldn't just sit back anymore and pretend that everything was fine. It's not fine. And if we don't speak out, nothing's going to change. Patricia looked at him with a mix of admiration and seriousness. And since you've gone public, what has the response been like from the community? Malik paused, his eyes flickering with a mix of emotions. There's been a lot of support, but there's also been a lot of hate. People are upset, saying that we're just stirring up trouble, but I think that's because they're afraid of change, afraid of having to face things they've ignored for too long. The interview continued, with Malik speaking from the heart. He shared his frustrations, his anger, and his hope for a better future. It wasn't just about one person or one school. It was about a movement, a shift that needed to happen on a larger scale. As Malik finished the interview and stepped off the set, he felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. He'd spoken his truth, and now there was no going back. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't stop now. The days that followed were a blur of media appearances, town hall meetings, and community discussions. People in West Valley, and even some from surrounding towns, were divided. Some of the older generations were resistant to change, clinging to old ideas and beliefs. Others were more open, eager to address the issues Malik and Jamal had raised. But despite the growing conversation, Malik and Jamal still found themselves facing hostility. There were online comments and messages that called them troublemakers, that blamed them for causing division. It hurt Malik more than he let on, but he couldn't let it break him. He couldn't afford to stop now, not when the conversation was finally happening. One night, Malik sat in his room, scrolling through his phone, when he saw something that made his stomach drop. It was a message from someone who went by the username West Valley Pride. The comment read, "You and your friend are just making things worse. We don't need troublemakers like you. Go back to where you came from." Malik stared at the words for a long time, the sting of the hate cutting through him. He wanted to respond, to lash out, but he knew that wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he took a deep breath and put the phone down. This was the price of change. This was what it took to challenge the system. He looked out his window, the lights of the town twinkling in the distance. His thoughts turned to Jamal. He hadn't seen him much lately, and Malik wondered how he was holding up. The weight of everything had to be getting to him, just as it was getting to Malik. The next day at school, Malik found Jamal sitting alone at their usual lunch table. Jamal looked up as Malik approached, his face a mask of exhaustion. "You okay?" Malik asked, taking a seat across from him. Jamal shrugged, the gesture dismissive, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "Just tired, man. All this stuff, it's a lot." Malik nodded. "I know, me too, but we can't back down. Not now. We've already made people start talking. That's a huge step." Jamal's lips pressed together, his eyes distant. "I don't know, Malik. It's one thing to talk, but what happens when nothing changes?" Malik leaned forward, placing a hand on the table. "We keep pushing, Jamal. That's the only way things change. We might not see it right away, but every time we speak out, every time we stand up, we make a difference, even if it's just a little one." Jamal met his eyes, the fire of determination flickering back in his gaze. "You're right. I guess I just needed to hear that." They both sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their words hanging between them. There was a long road ahead of them, but Malik knew that as long as they had each other, they could face whatever came their way. The town meetings became a battleground for change. Malik and Jamal stood side by side, their voices unwavering as they presented their case to a growing crowd. They spoke passionately about the need for racial equality, about the damage caused by indifference, and about the lives that could be changed if people started to listen. Each word they spoke was met with applause from some and resistance from others. The school board and local officials were forced to address the growing pressure, and slowly changes started to take shape. The school promised to implement anti-bullying programs, and new policies were put in place to prevent discrimination. But Malik knew that this was only the beginning. The fight for justice didn't end with a promise. And though things had started to change in small ways, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. He and Jamal had ignited a spark, but there was still so much more work to be done. But for now, he would savor the victories, knowing that with every step, they were getting closer to the future they dreamed of. Days turned into weeks, and the fervor around Malik and Jamal's fight for justice only intensified. The town of West Valley was no longer the quiet, sleepy place it had once been. It had become a battleground, not just for the boys' personal experiences, but for the very soul of their community. Malik knew that change, real change, was always messy, uncomfortable, and fraught with opposition. But it was in the midst of this storm that he felt a flicker of hope. He and Jamal had become local heroes of sorts, but the support they'd received from people who were genuinely moved by their bravery was often overshadowed by the ugliness of racism that continued to bubble to the surface. The town meetings, once hopeful and filled with promise, had become divisive, with some of the older generation clinging to outdated beliefs, unwilling to acknowledge the very real struggles that Malik and Jamal had raised. Malik, now somewhat accustomed to the pressure, had learned to tune out the comments of those who disagreed with him. His resolve only grew stronger as he saw the change that was slowly but surely taking root. The small victories, like the addition of diversity education programs at his school, were nothing short of monumental for a community that had spent years ignoring its problems. But there was still so much more to do. One afternoon, as Malik sat in his room, Poring over some notes for an upcoming school project, he heard a knock at the door. It was his mom, her expression serious but not unkind. "Malik, you've got a visitor," she said, her voice gentle but laced with concern. "A visitor?" Malik asked, confused. "Who is it?" "Someone from the city. They say it's important." Malik stood up, his curiosity piqued. The last few weeks had been a blur of media appearances and phone calls, but this was different. The person at the door didn't sound like another reporter or activist. It felt official. He walked into the living room where a man in a well-tailored suit was standing by the window. His sharp features and confident posture immediately marked him as someone who was used to being in control. "Malik Thompson?" the man asked, turning to face him. His voice was calm, measured. "That's me," Malik replied, not sure what to make of the situation. "My name is Samuel Curtis. I'm a representative for the city's Civil Rights Office," he said, offering a firm handshake. "I've been following your story and I'd like to talk to you about something important." Malik felt a ripple of tension pass through him. What could this be about? A part of him instinctively braced for more resistance, for more obstacles. But something about Samuel Curtis felt different. There was a sincerity in his eyes that Malik couldn't ignore. "Sure," Malik said, taking a seat across from him. "What's this about?" "Well," Samuel began, his tone even but serious, "we've been in discussions with the city council and local officials. They've been made aware of the work you and your friend Jamal have done to bring attention to the issues of racism and inequality in our community. And to be honest, not all of them are happy about it." Malik tensed, feeling a familiar anger bubbling beneath the surface. He had expected this. He knew the entrenched systems of power would push back. But what Samuel said next caught him off guard. "However," Samuel continued, "there's another group, a coalition of business owners, activists, and educators, who've recognized the courage you've shown. They're pushing for a larger initiative, one that could change things, not just in West Valley, but potentially across the state." Malik leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "What kind of initiative?" Samuel smiled, but it was a smile tinged with weight. "A scholarship fund, one that would allow students from underrepresented communities to receive educational grants, access to mentorship programs, and career development resources. But it won't just stop at education. The initiative also includes job creation, housing programs, and support for local businesses owned by people of color." Malik sat back, stunned. He hadn't expected this, not in a million years. The idea of something this large, this comprehensive, coming from the community he loved and had fought for, it felt like a dream. "This is real?" Malik asked, almost afraid to believe it. "Yes," Samuel replied, his tone unwavering. "But it's not going to happen without your support. We need you to help launch the initiative. Your story has inspired so many people, Malik. You've shown the power of speaking out, of standing up for what's right. You're not just a local hero anymore. You're the face of change for our entire state." The words hit Malik like a wave, a mix of awe and responsibility crashing over him. He had known this fight was bigger than just his school, but he hadn't fully understood the scope of what could be achieved. The weight of the opportunity and the burden was immense. He nodded slowly, trying to process the enormity of what was being asked of him. "I'll do it. I'll help, but I need to make sure Jamal's part of this too. This isn't just my fight, it's ours." Samuel's smile deepened and he nodded in agreement. "Of course, this is a movement for both of you." The next few days were a blur of phone calls, emails, and meetings. The wheels of change, once sluggish and resistant, were now turning at a rapid pace. The support for the scholarship initiative came pouring in, and soon, Malik and Jamal found themselves standing at the center of a monumental movement. As the day of the official announcement drew closer, Malik couldn't help but feel a sense of nervous anticipation. This wasn't just another town meeting or protest. This was a historic moment. The town hall where the initiative would be launched was packed, with people spilling out into the parking lot. There were reporters from local and even national news outlets, all eager to cover what was shaping up to be a turning point for the town of West Valley. Malik stood backstage, his hands trembling slightly as he looked at Jamal, who was pacing back and forth. "Hey," Malik said, grabbing his friend's shoulder to steady him. "You good?" Jamal stopped, looking at Malik with a mix of excitement and fear. "Yeah, just all this?" It's crazy, man. We've come a long way from where we started. Malik smiled, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. We couldn't have done it without you, without us, together. Just then, Samuel Curtis stepped into the room, his face glowing with pride. "It's time," he said, motioning for them to follow him. Malik and Jamal took a deep breath as they walked out onto the stage. The crowd erupted in applause, but Malik couldn't hear them. All he could focus on was the sound of his own heartbeat, the rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. They took their seats at the front of the stage, where the mayor and other community leaders were already gathered. As Samuel introduced them, Malik felt his hands grow clammy, but he forced himself to stand tall. He couldn't afford to show weakness now, not when so many people were counting on him. The ceremony went smoothly, with speeches about unity, change, and progress. But when Malik finally stood up to speak, the room grew silent. "Thank you all for believing in us," he began, his voice shaking but steady. "This is just the beginning. We've come a long way, but we have a long way to go. It's not about us, it's about all of us, standing together, making sure everyone gets the same chances, the same opportunities, and the same respect." His words were met with a standing ovation. For the first time in a long time, Malik felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time in his life, he truly believed that change was possible and that he could help make it happen. If you found this story impactful, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content that tackles important issues and promotes positive change. Your support helps us continue bringing you stories that matter. Thanks for watching.